My name is Jarod Reyes, and this is Andrew Baker.
Hey.
And we're on the developer education team at Twilio. And developer education team handles documentation at Twilio. A year ago, this team was just starting to get serious about documentation. If you had come to Signal last year and you had asked us about documentation, we would have said, yeah, we care about it and we want to make it awesome. And the title of today's talk is called How Twilio Writes Documentation, but we don't really think of ourselves as writing documentation. Everyone on our team is a developer, so we build documentation. And if you build documentation like you would build a product, you can start to really prioritize data and the developer experience and see fun things happen. So let's talk about what the last year has been like for us. Like I said, a year ago, we got serious about it. And so the first thing we wanted to do before we built this new product was to... First thing we wanted to do when we built this product was to look at the data and to figure out what kind of people were using our products. So in the last year, 800,000 users have used Twilio Documentation. That documentation is made up of 1,036 pages. And those pages are maintained by, any guesses? 4 people. Obviously, this isn't maintainable. 4 people managing 1,000 pages for 800,000 users is not something that we're going to be able to do for very long. And so one of the main things we're going to be talking about today is how we handled building a platform for documentation that was scalable and would allow us to collaborate with developers in our community and with other Twilions. But before we go explain exactly what we built and how we built it, let's talk about what the docs used to be. A year ago, if you visited the docs, this is the homepage you would see. It's probably very familiar to. Is this familiar to anyone? Recognize this? Yeah. This was a homepage for quite a long time, actually, even after we had built a developer education team. And the reason it works and it exists is because this is what documentation is around the world since the invention of the internet. Documentation, the kind of working theory was, take the knowledge base, take what you know about your product, whether you're an engineer or you're on a product team, and write a book. Explain exactly how this technology works, explain how to build something with it, and tell the developer how to do it. The problem is, it's a lot of writing, right? Here, this is the quick start page, more writing. We had some links to take you to the quick starts to give you some more information, but it was a lot of text. And in fact, when we looked at how developers were interacting on our pages like this how-to, we saw very interesting behavior. We asked developers in user testing to do a basic task. We'd say, what's your language of choice? PHP. What do you want to do? I want to figure out how to send an SMS. All right, show me how you would do that on Twilio Docs. And you know what the first thing they would do? They would leave Twilio. They'd go to Google. They'd go to the search bar, they'd be like, send SMS with Twilio in PHP. And then they would land on some sort of page that would explain that to them. But we knew that this was not an ideal experience. And the second thing we saw from them is they would land on the page and they would immediately scroll down the page and they would just kind of skim it and look for something valuable. The only problem is developers don't have time to read. All of those pages that you just saw were just tons and tons of text. We were explaining our concepts. We were basically breaking down our products for you. But we weren't showing you a lot of code. And the reason developers are too busy to read is because we're scoping points, we're building products, we're doing our job, right? We're upvoting our friends on Hacker News, whatever it is. We are busy. So reading a book-long worth of documentation is not something that fits into our workflow. But it's the way that we've done it for a long time, and it's for a good reason, right? When we started to teach anything at the beginning of mankind, go way back, just kidding, we're not going to go that deep, but we started to tell stories to teach people things, right? And stories still stick in the brain. It's the best way to learn something. And so people who are writing documentation, they love to write. They love to explain the stories, and they love to explain how they came up with this product and why you need it to make your business stronger. But that turns out not to be what you are looking for when you're in the middle of the flow. When you're in the middle of your workflow, we need to reduce the friction. So pages like this, that's just all friction. When you're in the middle of the workflow and if you do end up on this page, what do you do next? What do you actually need? You probably need either a solution to something you're trying to fix, or you need code that's going to show you how to develop the thing you were trying to build from scratch. This has neither of those, and it doesn't have a ton of great avenues to get there as well. This was true of all of our documentation. And so we focused on the how-tos because the how-tos were the lowest performing part of our docs. And we're like, well, There's 4 of us. Let's experiment. Let's get crazy. Let's see what we can do. Because we know when developers come here, they're going to go straight to the code. How can we put code first? So the first thing we wanted to do was experiment, but we also had 2 other problems. We had a usability problem because when developers would come to our site, they would say, why is your nav on your right-hand side? Like, tertiary navs just shouldn't be on the right-hand side. And that shouldn'ts and stuff are not very good in product building, so we wanted to get the data there. And it turns out that like humans just read and navigate better if content is on the left-hand side of the page, because we read from left to right, top to bottom, at least in Western countries. So they pointed out our right-hand nav, and they also said, you know, the hierarchy is kind of confusing. Like, what's the action on this index page? I see a beautiful quick start page, but like, what do I do? We hide some little red links in there, but it's not very obvious what to do. So we had some big problems to fix. But the first one we wanted to fix was how-tos. And the way we wanted to do that was we wanted to create a green field of experimentation. We wanted to give ourselves free reign and complete autonomy to build something that would put code first and would integrate with developers' workflows a lot better. And we had some good learnings from this early user testing. We knew that we wanted to build solutions that were production ready and fully scalable, because we heard from you, look, I'm trying to build a real business. I'm not trying to do, I'm not necessarily just trying to make a hack or a robot do something cool. I'm actually trying to build a scalable business. So we said, well, let's make our tutorials, our use case applications fully scalable and deployable. And the idea there was, well, let's integrate with Heroku. Let's do something really cool where people could just deploy instantly. And then we also heard that we need to have code be the story. Code needs to be the narrative, not a whole bunch of flowery prose explaining to me why this is going to make my business better. So we took a pass at that. This was the first iteration of what we were calling Viewsaurus. And Viewsaurus had some code, front and center. It also had the idea that this was an application that had multiple files, so you could kind of browse the files. And the idea was to highlight the code as if a buddy was sitting next to you explaining what he was building or she was building. So like when I was learning, the best way for me to get under the skin of an application was to sit next to the person who wrote it. They would tell me exactly why they wrote it this way, their thinking when they built the architecture. And this actually was super valuable, right? We go to hackathons and we learn that kind of thing. We go to school and we get the similar experience of people helping us become better developers. We wanted to kind of replicate that, and we knew we were going to have to do something like annotated code. But this pass just wasn't doing it for developers. They looked at it and they said, look, you're kind of pretending to be an IDE, but you don't have any of the features of an IDE. You're not full screen. You don't have a file explorer. This is like just a half-assed attempt at doing what I actually need. So we made another pass at it. And this iteration was the complete opposite direction. We're like, sure, IDE, full screen, let's give it to them. We had File Explorer, we had all the things that they had asked for, but we had taken for granted that what they had had in the first version was complete control over the page. And in this version, you scroll down the page a little bit, and we hijacked the scroll, and we went full screen. It was a horrible experience because it got in the middle of the flow, got in the middle of the code workflow, and it added friction to them getting the information they needed. They were coding, they hopped over to Twilio, this thing took over their page, they were like, oh my God, I need to go get a drink. Like, this is horrible. But we learned some we learned some good things from this iteration as well. We did some user testing, and they were like, what is this thing? Like, I like the icons, it's pretty, but what does it do? We're like, well, what do you think it does? And they're like, nothing. Well, you're right. But except it's kind of navigation, and it's kind of like our thoughts around. And again, it came down to us wanting to present something about our product and how we thought about building our product. It was just friction. It was just getting in the way of people coding. The other thing they said is, look, you still have things that are important on the right-hand side. I'm not going to read a ton of text, but if it's there and I need context about the code, I'm going to go to it, and you put it way over here. Not only that, but the main navigation of the thing is those 2 arrows, and that was on the right-hand side as well. We're all right, we can fix that. And we finally made this iteration, which we launched in March. This is Twilio Tutorials, and we launched it in March, and people were happy. It's an IDE. We put the File Explorer off on the side. We got rid of those things that we had really held dear. We stopped explaining why we built it. We stopped explaining, the architecture of the app in a sort of diagram. And we took away the deploy buttons. We got them out of the interface because it turns out developers weren't using them. Developers, all of us, are constantly building things that are unique to the problem that we have to solve. So giving you a solution that we think is going to be perfect for you is just not realistic. People weren't using it. So we freed up the space that we had taken up with those big buttons, and we just gave you more code. And in fact, some very, very interesting information and data came from this experiment. We saw that developers who were completing more tutorials had less to do with the actual use case we were describing and much more to do with how the tutorial was written or how the tutorial was built. I took server notifications off this graph because it just dwarfs everything else. But needless to say, developers love to learn how to send SMS when an error happens on their server. It's by far the most popular tutorial. But this graph shows you that we have other tutorials, and this is their completion rate. And this shows you that there's some tutorials that outperform others. And we were like, well, why do they outperform others? And it turns out there was a 30% higher completion rate if we reduced the first step code to less than 20 lines. So we were just showing what we thought was the most important thing first, right? We were like, okay, here's the controller. It takes a number, it provisions that number, then it sends an SMS, listens for an error code, it generates a Twilio response, and people were this was just too much context switch for them. They were jumping into something that was already way too deep in the weeds. And the only way that they knew that was because they skimmed the page, they saw a lot of code, and they bailed. So we reduced that, and there's a 30% higher completion rate. So instead of showing the controller, we'd show a config file, or we'd show a package.json file, and we'd see a lot higher success. The other thing we saw is that there's a 12% increase in completion rate if we just reduced the copy for everything. If we just put less words on there, people were much more likely to get through it. And it's because they were looking for the code, and because they were in the middle of coding, that was what they needed. There's another graph that I go to often, which is this pie wheel. And it's not actually incredibly valuable, but I love looking at it because when we first wrote tutorials, it was like 90% Ruby. I was like, look, Kevin, it's all Ruby. Like, everything's Ruby. And he's like, Jarod, there's 4 tutorials and 3 of them are Ruby. I was like, oh, that's right. But nowadays, we have 100% language coverage. We have over 150 tutorials. They're written in all of the major languages that Twilio supports. And we can look at this graph now and we can see our audience. We can see the makeup of the developers that are using our product. But we also can see which languages are performing better. And we can see that PHP author, whoever's writing those, is doing a hell of a good job. And nowadays, it's not just the 4 of us writing documentation. It's also a team in Ecuador that we work with. And every single developer in Ecuador and every single developer at home has a different specific language that they're good at. So when we see that the Node tutorials are outperforming anything else, or in this case PHP, we can go to that author and we can take the learnings that they have and we can implement them across the board. And it's kind of thinking about documentation as a product that allowed us to even start thinking of what's the data that we care about. You know, if you build a product, you really, really care about time on page and completion rates. But if you're just writing documentation, that's not necessarily the frame of mind you're in. So a note about tools, we built Vuesaurus using Node.js for the engine. So now it's an NPM package that any of our developers can check out on their first day of work. They can run a simple command line, and they can have an entire tutorial generated in a couple commands. It gives them a template, and they can start building on it, and it gives them that interactive experience, which is then rendered by Backbone. Another note, for testing and throughout these iterations, getting feedback, we used Optimizely to do A/B testing. So we changed that Heroku button. We made it a little bit skinnier and we changed the type, and we saw that a lot more people clicked it if we didn't say deploy to Heroku, we just said deploy. We also saw that that was different depending on the language and framework because some people weren't thinking about deploy. Mixpanel is how we track custom events, and there's a really cool feature in Mixpanel where you can see funnels. So we track custom events for every view that they did, every step that they viewed on the tutorial, and we were able to see which steps performed better than others in every single tutorial. And this is how we learned that the first step was crucial to getting completion. If we could get them past the first step, we could get them to completion, and that was all about reducing the friction on that first step. And then lastly, we use user testing for doing videos and interviews. And we actually were able to custom select Twilio developers to do the user testing. And it was invaluable. We just use this every month if we can because it gives us a ton of data. So we're onto something. We knew we could put code first and we would have better documentation for developers. We reduce the friction and we get them back to work. So to talk about how we're building it, oh, well, I'll just show you some more slides because they're there. Yay! So we had turned the least used part of the site into one of the most active parts of the sites following these principles. But to tell you about what we're doing next, And how we're going to get there is Andrew. Thanks,
Awesome.
bud.
Thanks, Jarod. So like Jarod mentioned, we had some early success picking a specific type of documentation, going deep on it, experimenting, iterating, and we saw those efforts bear some fruit. So after we were done with that, we were ready to take off a bigger chunk of work. But you know what, Jarod? Before we move on to that, maybe we ought to just gut check with the audience how much they agree with what we've learned. What do you think about a quick game of lecture, prose, or code? Okay, so right now, for the next few minutes, I want you to pretend that you are a member of our team. You are writing documentation for Twilio. And I've got 3 quick questions for you, and you're going to decide how to best document it. First topic is webhooks. Webhooks are a concept near and dear to any Twilio developer's heart, and good for web API development in general, but a hard concept to explain to people who are new to programming. So if you were going to explain how to use a webhook, an API webhook, to someone who didn't know about them, how many of you would try to do it face-to-face? And maybe write out a piece of documentation, a diagram? And how many of you would try and start with code? Okay, all right. So maybe a little heavy on code, but an interesting distribution. So the correct answer was code. This is a old iteration of a Twilio webhook guide. You can see we really didn't have much above the fold when a developer landed there. We tried to step them through like a 6-step diagram, but there was no code to be found until you got pretty far down on the page. So let's go to question 2. Let's get a little bit more specific this time, and let's talk about a specific API endpoint. So if you were going to explain how to use a specific API endpoint to someone, would you do lecture, code, or prose? Okay. All right, people are yelling code. Fantastic. So yes, code was the answer. And we got a little bit better on this one. This is our REST API lookups page. We have some code there above the fold, but it's just the endpoint of the API, which is not especially helpful because we normally try to steer developers towards using our helper libraries. Let's take a more interesting detour now. You are a 15th century Renaissance man, and you've just devised a brand new siege weapon for your sponsors, the Medici family. If you are going to explain how to get the Medici family's engineers to create this weapon of destruction, would you choose lecture, code, or prose? Great.
The correct answer is code.
The correct answer was code. So Leonardo da Vinci did not know how to program, but we imagine if he did, he would have gone with code. We're really just driving the point home here because this is something that we're really holding up as a big learning from the past year, but it's still difficult for us to keep it front of mind when we're working on Twilio's documentation. All of us joined this team because we like to write as much as we like to code, and so when we're approaching a new documentation task, it's really, really easy to fall into the trap of writing this beautifully constructed narrative, like getting your words super concise, really, really precise and accurate. And the truth is that all that effort most of the time is wasted unless you are showing a code sample to the developer front, center, early. So shifting gears a little bit, let's talk again about what we were going to do next in the docs. So we knew that we wanted to build a new platform to run Twilio's documentation, something that would serve as a really strong foundation for giving us the tools we needed to make all of these big changes we had in mind. So the things like fixing the information hierarchy, but also the kind of more experimental features that we sort of are twinkles in our eye. So we had some features, requirements that were important to us when we started on this. We wanted to try and use open source tools if we could. We wanted something that would allow us to do dynamic documentation, so maybe not necessarily showing the same content to 2 different users when they visit a certain page. We also, most importantly, wanted something that was easy for contributors to our documentation to collaborate and author Twilio's documentation. There are just 4 of us, but there are lots and lots and lots of people within Twilio who need to create and, most importantly, update and maintain documentation, and making our docs a good experience for them was really, really important. So we face the same challenge that every new software project has of, do we start from scratch, empty Git repo, or do we try and use an existing open source framework? And one of the cool things about our team, like Jarod said, is that we're all deep in different programming areas, so we could cast an especially wide net in this discovery phase, look in lots of different programming communities and see what good tools were out there. And one of them bubbled to the top, and it's this framework called Wagtail. Wagtail is a CMS framework which runs on top of Django, which is a Python web framework. And so if you're feeling a little weirded out at the idea of using a framework on top of a framework to build a website, you are not alone. We were also weirded out. But Wagtail had a few interesting features which really drew us in. It seemed to strike the right balance between features that come out of the box, but also flexibility to customize. So things like saving drafts of pages, keeping previous revisions of pages, tightly scoped permissions for our users so that we didn't have to give everyone access to edit all of Twilio's docs all the time. These were things that Wagtail gave us out of the box, and they seem to work pretty well. But because Wagtail is running on top of Django, a modern and kind of battle-tested web framework, we still had the flexibility to go and write straight-up custom web application code whenever we needed to. So we decided to dig into Wagtail, and we found this really killer feature that made the decision for us called stream fields. So in Wagtail, stream fields is this concept by which you can combine structured and unstructured content. And we use it primarily to put code samples and other content in the middle of our documentation. So for us, we knew that if we're thinking about building docs instead of authoring docs, we wanted to treat our code samples as first-class citizens. That means they're going to have their own model in the database, their own Django model, and we're going to wire up all sorts of additional functionality on top of them, which would be really, really hard to do if all those code samples lived in line inside our documentation. And Wagtail stream field makes it really, really easy for us to treat those code samples as the first-class citizens that they are, but easy for authors to drop it in the middle of a document. When an author wants to add a code sample to an existing document, all they have to do is click that tiny little plus button. This nice little menu comes up, and it says, do you want to drop in a code sample, beta feature stuff, rich text editor, or markdown? The author can choose whatever they're looking for that particular piece of content. And then you, as the end user, just see it as all one cohesive page. So we really, really like this flexibility. It seemed great for our authors. It seemed great for us for maintaining our code samples. And that's what really made the Wagtail a sell for us. So then we rolled up our sleeves and started building, did an MVP, scoped out stories just like any other project. But this isn't a DevOps doc, so I'll instead give you the highlights. I mostly spent time on the DevOps Reactions GIFs website. Two of my personal favorites, fixing a bug during a deploy, and perfect exception catching / handling. And we just kept on trucking. And one of the big changes we made in this first iteration of the CMS was to split all of our code samples actually out of the database and keep them in a GitHub repository. So we still store them locally for caching purposes, but we wanted the source of truth for Twilio's code samples to live in a public Git repo. So you can go right now to Twilio DevEd/API snippets, and you will see every piece of code that powers every code sample widget on twilio.com/docs. Now, the main motivation for us to take this big step so early in our development was because we wanted to start testing those code samples. So we thought that hosting them externally in a Git repository would be easier for us to hook in the kind of testing tools we wanted to use to make sure that Twilio's code samples are always accurate and functional. And right now we are doing some light testing on those code samples. So for compiled languages, we make sure that they compile, and for interpreted languages, we make sure that they run and exit successfully. But one of the fun bonuses of hosting our code samples externally on GitHub is that we can also solicit outside contributions. So you, right now, if you spot a bug in one of our code samples, you can go fork the repo, open a PR. As soon as one of us +1s and merges that PR, your change is going to be live on twilio.com/docs. So it's a really, really exciting way for all of you guys, our developers, who care the most about accuracy, to make sure that our docs are working for everybody. So we went live with the CMS at the beginning of April. We did a real kind of soft launch thing where it secretly started powering 4 pages of the documentation, and we've since ramped it up to serve all of /docs. So I'm going to let Jarod talk you through some of the big changes that we've made.
Yeah, so if you were at the keynote this morning, you may have seen some sneak previews of this, but I wanted to just highlight again how the learnings that we did when we were starting to get serious about documentation really affected how we thought about our new docs. The first thing you will notice...
We're not mirroring.
Oh, good call. Command F1. Boom. The first thing you will notice, this whole talk where we're talking about code first, is there's no code on this page, but I wanted to show you something else. This API reference is the new index page. So this is what you will see now when you visit API reference. And the first thing you might notice is that this is a new design. And it's not only a new design, but it's a responsive design. And the reason that it's responsive is not because we think that everything just needs to be responsive, but because we know that developers have a workflow that happens on very different devices all the time. Not everyone has a 30-inch Apple Cinema display. Some people are using docs on the road. Some people are using them on the BART. And other people are using them next to their beautiful IDE like Visual Studio or Eclipse or whatever you use. Sometimes having to switch out of that and view the code samples isn't extremely useful. So if you come to our REST API and you're using an IDE, you can now just pull up your code right next to the IDE you're using, see the parameters that you need to access, and you have a responsive design to help you do that. Again, it's just about getting out of the way of the developer and getting them back to work. There's one other thing that we do here to kind of match your IDE, and that's having a light and dark theme switcher. So we heard in user testing from a lot of people that, not only was it a context switch, but it was often a light environment switch where you would just go from working in a dark or light theme and you would get the exact opposite of whatever docs you were visiting. So we wanted to make sure that was not a problem to the degree that we not only switch the code samples, but as you can tell, we switch the reading environment so that the light environment matches a little bit more what your coding environment is. The other thing that we added was search, because we didn't want people leaving Twilio anymore to go search on Google. But there's also one benefit that we had if we controlled search, which is that Google, if you search send a message with image, you're probably going to get a page description, if you're lucky, and a link to that page. But if you search send message with image on Twilio, you will now get code first. Code is going to be the first thing that you see. You can switch languages, and now you can get right back to work. So you just found out the code that you were looking for without having to go all over the internet, without having to go to Stack Overflow or Google. And this is something that we can control and we can grow as more features come in from our developers. And the last thing I'll point out is that on these nifty little home pages, we replaced that right nav, which was kind of a dumping ground for all of our new products. So after Signal last year, we had video and IP messaging. Those went onto the right nav to live there forever. And instead of having it just be a navigation element, we really wanted to introduce the idea of filtering, because we know that developers not only are working in different IDEs and different languages, but they're working in different products at Twilio. So being able to give you the ability to switch between the product that you most use and the language that you most use gives you the ability to filter down the relevant documentation pretty quickly. We're very, very excited about building more filters based on your feedback. So if you have any ideas, please get in touch with us later today, or just go and give us feedback on the website, because this is something we are going to be working on like tomorrow. So to tell you a little bit more about the future and to give you a demo of something that we're really excited about is Andrew, who's going to take over right now. Thanks, bud.
Cool. Okay, so from the beginning of this talk, we've been talking about, we think about documentation as something that should be built, not something that should be written. And when you're building something, you build it out of lots of different pieces. And what we are really excited to do later this year is expose the pieces that make up our documentation through an API for you guys to use and consume. So later this year, we're going to start hosting documentation content behind Twilio's API. The first endpoint that we're targeting is code samples. So when you hit the code samples API, you will see every code sample that appears anywhere on twilio.com/docs. We'll give you some tools to search for them, filter them, slice them by your particular language. And our first kind of low-hanging fruit that we're really excited to tackle with this one is an embedding feature. So we'll add a little button to the bottom of the code sample widget which says embed, which gives you the ability to take one of our code samples and drop it wherever you want. If you're building another, another business that uses Twilio, you can use that to help your customers figure out how to interact with us. Or if you're just writing a personal blog post that uses Twilio and you want to have those code samples in there, it's going to be super easy to drop in. And once you drop it in, it's going to have the guarantee of us continually testing and updating these code samples so that we are keeping your content fresh for you. In addition to the benefit of that same code sample being implemented across all of the languages that Twilio officially supports. But when I think about the Docs API, I think about a workshop that I ran last fall with a group called Django Girls. So I live in Washington, D.C., and we did an event where we spent a day with a whole bunch of women who were new to programming and new to web development, and just taught them how to use Django. It's a fantastic group and a fantastic international organization, and it would have been really, really helpful during those exercises if there was some way for our attendees to get the information they needed to finish their Twilio exercises in the simplest way possible. Because when you're new to programming and you go out and try and read docs for something you don't know about, you can get lost really, really fast. You can feel lost and overwhelmed. And so I thought it would be really fun to just write a really quick Slack bot that can help us out with that. So I'm going to go ahead and start a new channel here. We'll call it Signal. Drop that in. And I'm going to go ahead and invite DocSpot to the channel. Invite them to join. Cool. So using the Docs API that we've got in its current state, I've just written up a really simple Slack bot. If you haven't tried using the Slack API yet and you use Slack in your organization, I highly encourage checking it out. It's a beautiful API to use, and it's really, really easy to get started. So there's a little bit of boilerplate stuff in here, but the magic happens in these few lines right here. So all we're doing is hitting the API with a tag that the user is going to provide in their mention of DocSpot, and we're going to bring back a code sample for the language that they're looking for. So I'm going to drop in my channel name up here. I'm going to skip over to my terminal, start up DocSpot. All right, connecting to Slack. And let's go back over here and say, hey, DocSpot, how would you do a lookup in Python? And we've got the code sample dropped in right there. And of course, the cool thing about all of our code samples is if someone was trying to go renegade at this Django Girls workshop and maybe do some Rails stuff, we can drop them in just the same. So that's something we're really, really looking forward to sharing with you all later this year.
Right on. So, we care a lot about documentation. We care a lot about getting you guys back to work and making sure that developers aren't stopped by the documentation they're seeing. So if you want to jam with us, if you want to talk to us about how you reduce friction, or if you just want to jam on documentation, please find us. We're going to be on the floor. And then tomorrow night, we're both going to be at Bash wearing crazy space outfits and playing silly games. So please come say hi and let us know what you thought. Thank you very much, guys.
Thanks, guys.